Good afternoon. We are slightly late, I think 15 minutes late, but unfortunately one of our speakers, Magdalena Gawin, was not able to come to our conference, but still I have a great privilege and pleasure to chair this panel on New Stories, Old Past, with a question mark, cultural dimension of dealing with the past. And we are going to have three speakers. Jarosław Kuisz from the University of Warsaw, Małgorzata Pakier from POLIN Museum, so the Museum of the History of Polish Jews, and Eugene MacNamee from Ulster University. So it's really an interesting dimension. We are going to have Polish North Irish takes on cultural mirroring and reflections on coming to terms with past, dealing with the troublesome past. Let me just briefly introduce actually our speakers in few words, because as I said, I have to rush a little bit. Jarosław Kuisz, who is going to be the first speaker, is an assistant professor at the Faculty of Law and Administration at the Warsaw University. He's a historian of law, political analyst, and he is also one of the editors of Kultura Liberalna review periodical in Warsaw. Obviously, Karolina and Jarek essentially are very quintessential for running the specific business. And Jarek is going to talk about what can lawyers learn from works of art, what is the role of art in transitional justice. Małgorzata Pakier, who is from the Museum of the History of Polish Jews. She will be talking on cold and hot memories in Poland and Europe, cultural aspects. If I can just find basically her I'm sorry, I didn't get a package actually for this conference, so I'm slightly disorganized today. Oh, there it is. So Małgorzata Pakier is the head of the Research and Publications Department at the POLIN Museum of the History of Polish Jews in Warsaw. She's also a member of the Social Memory Laboratory at the Institute of Sociology University at the University of Warsaw, and among many fellowships and stipends she received. I should mention that she was a research fellow at the Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies at the US. And then finally we have Eugene MacNamee, who writes and researches on the interface of culture and constitutional arrangements in Northern Ireland. He's a graduate of the University of Reading and the European University Institute. He lives in Belfast and is the head of the law school at the Ulster University. I could actually talk longer and longer, but I suspect that we really have to start at this point. I suggest that each speaker will have 15-20 minutes. There are only three of you, which means that we should have approximately 20 minutes for Q&A. I would really love to have some Q&A, and we should give a chance to our audience to ask you questions. Jarek, please start.
Thank you very much. Okay, so if it's 15 minutes or even 20, let's go to the point. So the main subject of my presentation is about the interplay between cinematographic works and transitional justice, which is something that could seem somehow unusual at first sight, but I think that at least after this presentation I hope you will have some questions and we will resolve some problems, maybe. Law and film studies and law and history studies and film and history studies are well established in science. Maybe they are not as present as fields of studies as law and economics, for example, but nonetheless they are present and they are developed since almost 30 years as what regards law and culture studies. But putting this aside for a moment, I would like to start with an anecdote that is so important for some to understand, to grasp the situation. I could afford it because so much was already said about the transitional justice theories. So I would like to go down for a while. So at the beginning of in the mid-90s, something really interesting happened in Warsaw. Richard Rorty, prominent philosopher, came to Warsaw. There was a big conference, and the intellectuals like Jürgen Habermas, Leszek Kołakowski were invited. Leszek Kołakowski could not come, but anyway, others came, and something really interesting happened. Because as you know, what was in the fashion was postmodernism at that time. And in the mid-90s, Richard Rorty and his theories were really fashionable. That was something that people would like to hear. And of course, he came to Warsaw and he started to explain that such notions as he started to ask questions like, could one, pragmatically speaking, put such notions as truth, transcendental truth, and reason in the center of our own culture? And of course, Rorty based his explanations on pragmatism, and something remarkable happened. Polish intellectuals from left to right opposed it. I mean, during this discussion, regardless the opinion, political opinions, their biographies, they all opposed postmodernism. And there was no profound explanation for that up to the moment when Andrzej Walicki, an expert at political philosophy, tried to grasp the sense of this opposition, because at first sight it was something that was even surprising to participants of this discussion. He tried to understand in such terms that that this post-communist reaction, so to say, was that in countries like Poland, societies were accompanied with different fears than those mentioned by Richard Rorty. That these fears were so different that the need of epistemological and moral certainty emerged after dogmatic Marxism and communist fundamentalism. So this kind of opposition was somehow justified by the experience, and Walicki argued, here I quote, "People are worried that without objective, universal standards, one could more easily be subjected to manipulation. In these circumstances, contextual, situational, anti-transcendental concept of truth is suspicious because it is perceived as strangely similar to the dialectic sophism of Marxism." So why we start with this? I think that we should see the problem of coming to terms with the past, the communist past, in this larger perspective, and because it could also explain where we are now. But I would like to add also something to the previous presentations. Someone who is not from the region could ask herself, is coming to terms with the past, is it still a problem? 2016? I mean, is it a serious problem? And the answer must be positive. And at least we could say it on 4 layers. On a legal layer, we have still ongoing legal proceedings. Just to tell you, I would like to refer mainly to the Law and Justice era, so to say, because it's very instructive to see what happened before the last elections. So, for example, September 2013, father of Grzegorz Przemyk, a teenager beaten to death by militia in the summer of 1983, received a compensation of 20,000 euro due to the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg ruling. This kind of rulings have a tangible influence, because what happened next? Other parents of victims started to talk publicly that they are going to do the same. So this legal layer is of importance as to as to how it is perceived. What is also important to see that the ruling was given by the court, non-Polish court. But even in Poland, we have, for example, 2014. One could learn from the mass media that ex-dissidents struggles in courts for an indemnification of 120,000 zlotys for severe repressions he suffered from the communist secret services in 1988. And it's interesting that the Court of Appeal overruled the ruling of the Court of First Instance that was unfavorable, but in a sentence, 2014, a judge pointed out that a plaintiff deserves respect for years of his heroic struggle. 2015, 2016, I mean, it's still on the agenda, so I would go to another layer that is political. Here I would like to say that it's not only a Polish problem. I mean, when there were elections in the Czech Republic, for example, to discredit one of candidates for the presidency, billboards, anti-communist billboards were used widely in the country. So it meant that someone at least considered that it could be used as a powerful argument to discredit his opponent, political opponent. So this political layer is always there. It depends on how powerful it is. Then we have the third and fourth layer, which is social and cultural. I would not neglect tabloids in this respect. I mean, if there, for example, one of the most important tabloids had a series of publications with photos of a chief of communist secret services in Poland, Jarosław Kiszczak, that he, and the story is very, very, very short, that he is unable to come to the court for proceedings because he's unfit according to some medical opinions, but when we see him on photograph, he's smiling, cheerful, and he's in such a good shape that it should provoke some kind of reaction on the reader's side. So it means that, and it lasted for weeks, this kind of campaign in tabloids. So I think that in the West, nothing of that kind is present because that's purely post-communist story. And fourth layer is aesthetics of transitional justice. Here I pick up the term that was used in South Africa. The aesthetics of transitional justice means that there is some reaction in culture to the post-communist era, that something is going on that should be explained by the works of art. And here we could really mention works of art from the region, but also it's really interesting to see that in Baltic countries we have works of art like this, we have in South America and so on. So this is quite a new field of study, and I think that is going to develop. As to the TJ, so many was said that TJ studies, I would just say, just to mention two things, that TJ itself is a subject of study because of these 30 years of development, that you could have this meta-reflection on the subject. But also, it is highly political subject. I mean, you cannot just say that there are no references. I mean, TJ is purely political subject, and that's something that one should take into consideration. So saying that, or rather reminding that, I would just to go to these reasons of coming to terms into past and why it takes so much and why there is this reflection in works of art. So because that was not said, why we should have this transition, why people require after 1989 they expect something that something should happen in the courts. So just to remind you that Andrzej Paczkowski, when he wanted to give a brief description of the system, he said that communist countries in the region were always repressive, always criminal, always ready to use violence on a massive scale, including the army, and in its early days, communist system was also simply murderous. So that was these 4 points that he wanted to describe the phenomenon of historical communist background in the region. So when we have this 1989-1990 era, when everything decides how this thick borderline, how this thick line is going to be treated, how it is going to be realized. Now we have the conclusions, and here I would like to give you some information why this is still an ongoing process and why it could be still a background for some works of art. In Poland, at least, we could say let's split it into 2 decades. So, first decade is 1989-1999, and for advocates of the severe punishment of communist crimes, they could consider this as a lost decade. A lost decade. Why? Not a single judge lost his post for the reason of not judging in an independent way during the period of communism. However, and here we have this gray zone, however, always something happened. It is not this black and white scheme. However, 39 judges lost some rights to receive full retirement pension for judges. In the years 1991 and 1999, there were more than 1,100 investigations into the crimes from the Stalinist period. However, as to the official data of 2003, only 29 persons were condemned. So, in spite of the fact that Aleksander Kwaśniewski asked for pardon for communism, because something like this happened in 1993, I mean, that was this statement went unnoticed, in fact. So that's the first decade. In the second decade, so 1999-2009, there is still no equivalent of the second Nuremberg that some expected. One cannot forget about the various actions, such as, firstly, of course, activities of the Institute of National Remembrance. We talked about it today, that such institutions were set up, but it's really interesting to see the data. Because the data could be surprising. The institute was established by the Polish Parliament in 1998, started its activities in 2000, and the legal definition of communist crimes appeared in the Act of Law. And then, what is really interesting, that 10 years of activities, first 10 years of activities of the Institute resulted in filing only 242 charge sheets against 385 persons, and only few persons were condemned. Interesting enough that the grass is always greener on the other side. If Poles would like to criticize lustration, this kind, they refer to Czech Republic. They say, or to Germany. It was always better there. Interesting enough that the Institute for the Study of Totalitarian Regimes in the Czech Republic gave the information that in 20 years, only 104 people were accused, 33 people were sentenced, but only 10 people were imprisoned. So, again, because there were presentations on the subject, so I just would like to quote, maybe to make the long story short, Václav Havel, who shaped the politics to some extent, but in the end, also he was somehow disappointed, because in one of the interviews he said that even the Czech Republic had been unable to resolve well the problem of lustration. So that is the background, and I think that the works of art that would like to react to the problems of justice of post-communist era should be treated in a larger landscape, because what we have, we live in the era of unprecedented proliferation of images. Laurent Gervais, who wanted to divide the history of the impact on public, the impact of images on public, wrote that due to technological advances, we could say about the paper period from 1848 till the First World War, then film projection period from the First World War till 1960s, and then we have the period of the TV screen, so up to 2000, and now we have this post-television era, and we live also in the era that we have some kind of images that are proliferated on an unprecedented scale. For example, never ever there were so many pictures of films made about lawyers, about courts, about justice. I mean, it's omnipresent. We have in the States there are even channels, special TV channels with that are sacrificed only to this subject. So American experts, scholars says that law saturate our culture on an unprecedented scale, and one cannot just think about it that it is still some kind of idle diversion, because it isn't. So that's a larger picture, and I think that these post-communist works of art should be treated as just as an example of a larger picture, and because so many of these works of art are. So I have to choose something to give you more tangible examples. So as to Poland, there were some scholars and politicians and artists that regretted deeply, and they still do, that there were no second Nuremberg. So what do you do if there is no second Nuremberg? You do it. You write a play. You write a play, and the play was filmed and was shown in the prime time on public TV. It was the title of the play was Nuremberg, as simple as that, 2006. And a short summary of the play is as follows. A former colonel of communist secret services demands an honest trial and just punishment for what he did. It's already incredible, but that's the point of departure. And he confesses that to someone from the next generation. So, young journalist, he confesses all the crimes that he committed in the past. And, again, to make it shorter, even this small Nuremberg is not possible because some obscure, not shown on the screen, secret functionaries of secret services are not interested in revealing the truth. The colonel dies in an obscure way. That's the end of the story. So, but the message of such stories, because it's just the example, that was just one play in a series of other plays. The series was called the Stage of Fact. There were the Stage of Fact that was done between 2006 2011, and mainly about the legal issues from the communist past. It's incredible that most of the subjects were dealing with TJ. I mean, these were plays made about the TJ subject. So, for example, and that's a wonderful interplay between art and reality, is that 2004 we have the Supreme Court ruling on rehabilitation of victims of the so-called meat scandal in 1964. There were where even a death sentence was pronounced. And what happened? 3 years after, we have a play. So it's this kind of distribution and this interplay between art and law is really interesting, because I think it's highly justified to think it's a part of TJ. And what is also interesting to say that to see it not only as a Polish phenomenon, still you have these works of art in the Czech Republic. I could mention Agnieszka Holland Burning Bush, of course, but I think that the movie that was so close to a movie that was made in Poland that it's almost like a twins is Kawasaki Rose, made by Jan Hřebejk in 2009. And again, it's so interesting to see that at the heart, the story. Again, to make it short, there is a documentary movie that is supposed to be made about a psychiatrist who signed the famous Charter 77. So this the man will receive a major award for being a hero of the opposition, and so on. However, in the course of filmmaking, it turned out that he cooperated with secret services. So is he a hero or not? I wouldn't like to spoil you the pleasure of seeing the great film, but what is really interesting is that you have in the heart of the movie is a juristic problem, because what was said in the movie underwent the lustration procedure. So it turned out that there is even in the movie the year of verification is literally given. It's 1992, so it's 1 year after the first act of law on the lustration, the Czechoslovakia. But it turned out that in the movie the message that you receive is that, okay, so law failed. the state, the post-communist state failed, and it turned out that he wasn't a hero. I mean, he cheated his wife, his family, and so on. So, I mean, why is it so important? Because I think that it is just the example. I could give you much more. But the point is that what is the message for the audience? That the law and prestige of the law and state in post-communist countries was, to say it mildly, not very high. I mean, as the message for the future generations is that there is nothing to be proud of, and all those procedures that failed in the court could have its equivalent in art, but if you suffuse your culture on such a level with this kind of messages, it's maybe less surprising to see what is going on now. Because in 2006, this year, we sit here, we are comfortable, but in Poland there is a huge quarrel about street names, who is going to stay as a communist and who is not communist, because we have, I don't know which wave of decommunization wave in Poland. But it is still on the agenda. And the last thing I would like to sum it up, and I think that what is on stake, that Paul Connerton, expert on collective memory, once wrote that those for whom it was the most difficult to adapt to the rules of the new political system, and also for those who suffered the most under the old political system, they seek for something more than just revenge for the wrong done in the past. They look for the verdict that would be a verdict once and for all, because it confirms the legitimacy of the winners. The point is that Connerton was referring to the French Revolution. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now we are going to hear Małgorzata Pakier.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much, Karolina, for inviting me here. I'm really very honored and happy that I can speak to such an audience. The title suggests that I would talk about Polish and European memories, and in fact I want to try to show a bit alternative view of Polish memory processes, showing it from a broader global European cosmopolitan perspective. So my starting point is that we can observe today an emergence of an almost subfield of Eastern European memory studies, and these have East European memories and studies, and that has become an important trigger for reviving the debate on European memory, and it has emerged from it too. But there is also some specific way how East European memories are presented in these studies that are in the international literature that is now blooming. And to skip the longer introduction, I just will mention that these studies suppose some kind of uniqueness of memory processes in this region, including Poland, of course. And this uniqueness lies, for example, in the fact that East European memory cultures are presented as, above all, post-dictatorial and post-violent. So it is World War II and communism that are not only in the past, but they are also heavily weighing on the whole post-1989 period, which itself, which is interesting, is almost undefined in memory studies as a blank spot without its own history. Memories in Eastern Europe are often described as being out of balance or showing no signs of stability. This is a very typical characterization, and I'm quoting here from an excellent volume by William Blecker, who was yesterday here, and Alexander Etkind about memory studies in Eastern Europe. Memories there are often described also in terms, mostly in terms of mnemonic pathologies. There is too much of memory, there is excess of memory in Eastern Europe, and memories are presented as tortured, warped, and quite different from the consistent narrative of the Western memory. So we have this image of unique and tortured memories in Poland. And this excess of histories and victimhood claims results in militant competition of memory and conflict. And it is memory wars, memory conflict that seems to be the dominating paradigm for interpreting memories in Poland and in Eastern Europe, while the public sphere is imagined as being too narrow for these diverse memories to coexist. And we get quite a literal representation of such a claustrophobic memory space in the almost paradigmatic study of the Warsaw city space by Elżbieta Janicka, who was already mentioned here today, and I mean the book Festung Warsaw. Here, in her study, both the past and the present memory space appear as a limited resource. And she studies the former Jewish district of Warsaw, Muranów, that during the war was turned into the ghetto, and she studies this as a memory space. And before World War II, these neighborhoods were inhabited by Jews. During the war, as mentioned, they were the place of the ghetto. And during the war, also after the Warsaw Ghetto uprising in '43, in the ruins of the ghetto, there were the fights of 1944, the Warsaw Uprising. And these layered history are presented also in the city space today, and where the Jewish past is repressed by the Polish militant nationalist narrative. And this is how Elżbieta Janicka describes it. She writes about courtyard chapels and plaques commemorating the insurgents and victims of street executions from '43 that couple with silence about the Jewish history of the area and thus symbolically dominate it. And her study is quite right, but maybe there is a possibility of an alternative view of memory spaces in Poland. An alternative vision of the Warsaw Ghetto as a site of memory was presented by Michael Rothberg, who discussed its various meanings in terms of a multidirectional memory, putting it into a global post-colonial context. As a resonant international symbol, the Warsaw Ghetto becomes a knot of memories on the Algerian war, on apartheid or Gaza. With this, Rothberg introduces Warsaw into the global memory map, and what he does is, as he explains, an unsettling of the location of Warsaw as memory site by introducing its multivalenced, multidirectional memories and by questioning the place's self-sameness. He thus gives us a diametrically different to Janicka's vision of Warsaw as an open, malleable symbolic space for a multitude of memories. And this concept by Rothberg belongs to the new thinking about memory today without limitations, as Anne Rigney recently called it at a conference in Warsaw, and especially without limitations of the nation and ethnos. I will just recall here similar concepts of post-memory by Marianne Hirsch, of prosthetic memory by Alison Landsberg, unbound memory by Nathan Schneider and Dani Levy, or traveling memory by Astrid Earle. Memories here are not fixed once and forever to particular places or groups. They may be borrowed by other groups. They may travel to different places. Traveling transcultural exchange is, in fact, as Astrid Earle says, what makes memory cultures alive. Memory changes in time, but it is dynamic not only in the diachronic sense, transmitted through generations or in form of a political palimpsest. Memory, as Susanna Radstone would add, is dynamic also in the spatial sense, and she stresses the contemporary geographical mobility, portability, and transmissibility of cultural memories. So I'm drawing attention here to the stream of thinking about memories as migrating between cultures, places, and social groups. Interestingly, East European memory studies focused on its distinct qualities stays away from these theories, which is a bit surprising given that the international transcultural exchange is at the very foundation of these studies, actually. So in the following, what I would like to do is to show a few examples of an alternative interpretation of memory dynamics, memory cultures in Poland, in Eastern Europe, and actually more specifically in Warsaw, trying to show, interpret the same area that was studied by Elżbieta Janicka, and this is the first picture. This is a building at the United Nations Circle Square in Warsaw. It is it doesn't look like that, but it is one of an important symbolic historical building, one of very few that survived the war. Before the war, at pre-war illustrations, we see it as a part of a vibrant Jewish district, and during the war it was part of the Jewish ghetto. And it survived as one of very few buildings in this area the war. And in the 90s, the area has changed. You can see how the neighborhood looks like, because land was cheap there, and it is also relatively close to the city center. Many bureau offices were built there, so it became also a bit of symbolic for the capitalism of the 1990s, for the transformation period of post-1989. What I am interested in is the writing, the graffiti on the building, which was recently covered. There is part of the writing that was still there in 2011. Imigracja to nie zbrodnia, and it means immigration is not a crime. We can interpret it as a use of this historical symbol of this Jewish memory code, and by memory agents who are trying to inscribe it in the new contemporary context and the contemporary issues of multiculturalism, globalization, immigration. We have example, and we can see the same process that was described by Janicka, this erasure of memories, this covering it with the grey paint, and this legia by football fans, which can be, it has this nationalist connotations. But still on this wall, there is something more, which is very interesting. I don't know how to show it. It is almost imperceptible, but when you look over here, you will see a writing with Hebrew letters, which in Yiddish, it's written in Yiddish, and it says Antifa. And I found another one a few streets further on Żelazna. This is the same writing, Antifa. It is in Yiddish. I think it's very interesting. And I still don't know who is the one who makes these graffitis there. But it's not really a counter memory. It's not a militant fighting memory, because if you don't know Hebrew letters, you will not even notice that there is something written there. So you need to have this cultural competence, not just to write it, but to even notice the writing here. It is, to me, it's rather a model of an alternative memory narrative, not a competing narrative.
But what's the narrative? I'm sorry.
Okay, I will refer to it. Should we leave it for the questions? Sorry. What's more, this is how the neighborhood looks today, but there is another thing, another interesting. I thought it was original, but unfortunately it's an artistic project. But it is a projection of a certain memory gesture. What's the gesture? What's the projection about? It's about someone who is coming to Warsaw, and it's trying to mark her belonging to the place, but at the same time it's her not belonging by choosing the English language, my family's roots, so the writing is not in Polish but in English. But still, this may be some heritage memory pilgrim coming to Poland, maybe with coming from a Polish Jewish diaspora living in the United States. This is how we can imagine what has happened here. What's more, there is on Chłodna, there is a mural commemorating the wooden bridge that was during the war was connecting the small and the big ghetto in Warsaw. And this is a commemorative project there that says, the writing says, there in 3 languages, starting from the higher level. Do is gewein a brick, and then it is in Yiddish, then in Hebrew po haya pam geshe, and in Polish tam była kładka, and it all means there once was a bridge. So just to commemorate that there was this bridge. But what is again very interesting here, can you see the correction until the first layer? The correction is really fascinating to me. There was one letter missing, beit, before the letter resh, and the correction is just a minor thing, a lapsus almost, but for memory process in Poland, it shows a very significant moment, an appearance of a new memory agent whose competence in Jewish Yiddish culture and language is much higher than of that person who tried to commemorate it in the first place. So we have something new coming up. And there is another interesting project initiated by the POLIN Museum, who invited international artistic team, and it was a cooperation of a Turkish artist, Ashley Czefushoglu, with a Polish group of artists, and they have invited local community to do excavations in the place of the former ghetto. To what they found in the ground was this. And this is how the process looks like. This is an encounter of the international artistic team with the Polish local community. And the last thing that I found on my way home, this is not the former Jewish district, neither the former ghetto area. This is, so to say, an Aryan memory space in Warsaw. This is not a place where you would find signs of Jewish memory. Jewish memory is not only repressed, it's just absent, it's not mentioned. And I find going home a Hanukkah on the wall. It's not simply a menorah, it's Hanukkah. So a candlestick for Hanukkah. It's like a memory traveling within Warsaw, but traveling much farther than just a neighboring district. It's traveling beyond culture. It's transcultural travel. And this was just a few impressions actually that I wanted to show you, and I was thinking about some kind of summary for that would fit into the theme of transitional justice. I am not a transitional justice specialist, I'm a memory scholar, but Erika later was already mentioned here today by Anna Wawrzyniak, and I'm very grateful for this because I very much appreciate her work, and especially her concept of a safe space of memory. And this is how she described Kazimierz in Kraków, transgressing the typical interpretations of Kazimierz as kitschy reconstructions of Jewish heritage by Poles. She actually interprets this space as a unique opening in which Jews and Poles regularly cross paths and face-to-face encounter that has traditionally grounded the ethical is what is most interesting there, that Poles living there are meeting with Jews traveling to Poland, Jews hating Poland and missing it at the same time, meeting with Poles. This is how she presents Kazimierz, saying that this space has become a focal point for the significant moral, emotional and political transactions as victims, witnesses, perpetrators and their descendants. And this would be for the conclusion. Thank you.
Thank you. And we are moving from Poland to Northern Ireland. Eugene, MacNamee, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Karolina Vigora, for inviting me along. We are moving from Poland to Northern Ireland. The question is why? I can see a couple of reasons why we might, but still, certainly, it's it's becoming a memory for Northern Ireland. The notion that it is a territory of transitional justice, except in the limited sense that it now finds transitional justice to be part of a kind of thriving export industry that it can capitalize on to some extent, being as how it is identified as a kind of success story of transitional justice, that it had a troubled past out of which it has successfully created a normal present, albeit with certain qualifications on that normality, but nonetheless the contrast between a situation of fairly massive civil conflict and the situation of fairly massive normality, albeit given those minor incidents of resistance to the normality, very strongly characterises Northern Ireland as a success story of transitional justice. And there can enter at that point a certain link to the Polish experience, in the very limited and perhaps trivial sense that the Polish community is one of the few communities that has voluntarily taken up residence in Northern Ireland in the post-conflict period. So there are a lot of Polish shops. There's a very vibrant Polish community, in part because of the economic boom in the Republic of Ireland that gradually, and through the 1990s, that gradually spread. There's a porous land border, of course, between the Republic and Northern Ireland. And so people came to visit, I suppose, and realized that it's not so bad and that there were some economic opportunities there. And so that economic picture has, and I think there's probably some credit to be given to the Polish diaspora community for this, that the situation of normality is characterized by very low unemployment rates, by fairly good social housing stock, by low rents and low property prices, by increasing foreign direct investments in various different sectors, including in the legal sector, which is something of interest to me. So increasingly it's a very strong picture of social normality, which allows for this story of successful transitional justice to gain international purchase. And the local industry is, spans the governmental to the non-governmental to the academic, in the sense that both universities would have a whole series of courses in conflict and post-conflict and peace studies and reconciliation studies and transitional justice. So there's a lot of kind of international student income generated by the kind of teaching program. Likewise, there's a lot of government trips that take place in order to demonstrate to the Basques that it's possible, or to the Colombians that it's possible, or to whoever that it's all possible. So transitional justice for us is even accepting the point that I think that Adam Czarnota made, that just because it's now a successful example of transitional justice doesn't mean that anyone knew they were doing transitional justice at the time that it was all happening. So I suppose the standard story for the transitional justice, the rollout of a successful transitional justice program in Northern Ireland would be that you had the outbreak of a massive civil conflict, and then in the 1980s, there was a kind of shift on both sides of that civil conflict. If we take one side of the conflict to be the state forces and the other side to be the kind of forces of resistance against the state, the Republican movement that were seeking United Ireland, in broad terms, again, to say those that wanted the maintenance of the unity with Britain and those that wanted the dislocation and relocation of Northern Ireland into an entire political community in the whole island of Ireland, island of Ireland. Then two things happened at the beginning of the 1980s that kind of shifted the balance of relationship, and the kind of standard story would be that those two political shifts that began at the beginning of the 1980s led gradually to the eventual political settlement in 1998. And those two things were the hunger strikes in 1981, where you had a series of political prisoners that refused the status of normal prisoners and therefore went on hunger strike to say that they were prisoners of war and that they would die rather than be identified as standard prisoners. And so in fact 10 of them did die. And as a means of generating publicity during the course of that hunger strike, one of those hunger strikers, a man named Bobby Sands, he stood for election as an MP to the British Parliament, and he was elected. And obviously couldn't take his seat and eventually died. But the amount of publicity generated for the Republican movement internationally, so for example, the renaming of Winston Churchill Avenue in Tehran into Bobby Sands Avenue, the avenue that ran alongside the British Embassy in Tehran, the generation of international publicity and kudos on the back of having entered into the political sphere, taking leave of an absolute position of simply armed resistance to British rule, was seen to be so successful that the Republican movement from that point forward gradually adopted at first a twin strategy of the Armalite and the ballot box, a kind of militaristic and political strategy that eventually developed into a full-scale political strategy. And the British government reframed its relationship to the Republicans accordingly, first of all by entering into back-channel negotiations to try and encourage that process, but also by ceasing to treat the problem of Northern Ireland as simply one that could be confronted with a militaristic solution, but rather created a process of what they called pacification, which was a social interventions in order to try and bleed away support from the military wings. In large part, that consisted of investment in public housing stock, investment in putting government resources into Northern Ireland by, for example, citing the tax offices for car registration in Northern Ireland, or for multiple different government agencies were cited in Belfast and around Northern Ireland in order to pump money artificially into the economy. So you had a kind of pump priming of the economy in order to pacify the population, at the same time as creating political channels to supposedly implacable enemies. And these implacable enemies on the other side were likewise in a kind of game of charades where were developing their own political strategy at the same time as maintaining a rhetoric of absolute resistance through armed struggle. So that would be the standard story, and I suppose my story would be somehow complementary and somehow a corrective to that story by saying, well, all of that works to a certain extent, but it doesn't quite supply a kind of necessary missing ingredient, which is why in 1998 people were willing to break out of what had always been the received paradigm for conceptualizing the relationship between Britain and Ireland, and therefore the situation of Northern Ireland as a conflictual territory, which was that either Northern Ireland is British or it's Irish. Whereas at that point in 1998, they were able to come up with a political settlement of quite some complexity that reflected a quite different idea, which was that as long as you had a replete symbolic territory that somehow could be expressed in kind of oblique institutional terms, then you didn't need to have a definite territorial identity that was tied to a constitutional position that would say, I'm British or I'm Irish. You could identify as being British or Irish while still inhabiting the same constitutional territory, so long as there was the reordering of the institutions and the institutional language such that that became an imaginative possibility. So it's on that level that I'm trying to make a slight corrective to that grand overall story, which is say that the imaginative work also had to be done in order to make possible the political settlement, and the imaginative work was done in the cultural space rather than in the space of politics itself. Politics received eventually as a gift the imaginative work that had been done in a different space. And I could use various examples, but I'll focus in on one example which was kind of paradigmatic in and of itself, I suppose, in the sense that it very self-consciously took on that task, and that is a group of cultural activists called the Field Day Group, that some of you may or may not have heard of, that are temporarily coterminous with those other developments in the 1980s. So the Field Day Group was a theatre and cultural critical group that was formed in Derry in 1979 that had its first performance in 1980. So at the same time as the hunger strikes were starting, you had this group setting out on its path of critical cultural intervention. And that was exactly its self-defined program of what it was doing. It was trying to, through cultural intervention, make some massive reordering of the social space, the social imaginative space. And again, if I narrow in the focus and take as a kind of point of beginning, the first production by that group was I should probably mention a few of the members of that group to give you an idea. It may or may not give you an idea, but I'll try and help you out if it doesn't, of the kind of cultural weight of that group. So the original members were Seamus Heaney, Tom POLIN, both professors of poetry here at Oxford during their various points. Seamus Dean, who is a very famous post-colonial critical commentator within Ireland. Stephen Ray, that some of you may have come across now. He's quite a well-known Hollywood, and he's in a lot of UK TV series, and some others that you wouldn't know. But nonetheless, the kind of general point is this was absolutely the intellectual cream of Northern Irish and Irish, society. That particular intellectual cream that links the cultural space and the academic space. It wasn't just either one or the other. It was both the kind of production of artistic product, but it was also reflective commentary on that product. And one of the leading lights there was a guy called Seamus Dean, who to some degree reflected that kind of critical commentary angle. So he was the principal commentator, and his approach was very self-consciously post-colonial. So his notion was that Northern Ireland was the suppurating wound that was the result of the colonial British intervention, eventually, aeons before, and you had to see that in the broad global, in the frame of post-colonial studies generally throughout the academic world, that was a very useful analytic to bring to bear upon this kind of situation in Northern Ireland, and that reframing as post-colonial would somehow deflect attention, it would defuse the time bomb of a kind of local squabble, a local fight. It wasn't that. The local fight was itself the product of a post-colonial intervention a century before, or depending on how you read the pattern, many centuries before. And in that, I suppose, it's very similar to a lot of the analytics that have been done on Rwanda, for example, the kind of standard governmental story above all, that, that unfortunate incident was itself the result of the outworking of a long-term colonial intervention many, many years before. So that was kind of self-consciously his position. But more importantly, perhaps in terms of the artistic product rather than the critical commentary as product, was the plays that were produced by Brian Freeland. The first of those plays was a play called Translations, that you may or may not have heard of. But nonetheless, even from the title, you may get an idea of where it's all going, that there is something in the process of moving from one space to another that requires imaginative work, and that it is transformative in itself. So this is to some degree related to your point, Carolina, that even the process of change in itself is, perhaps a kind of question to you would be whether it's necessarily cathartic or as likely to be traumatic as cathartic. So his story was of the Ordnance Survey mapping of Ireland in the latter part of the 19th century, when the place names that were in Irish were changed into place names in English. And he plays this out with a story of a young British officer that comes to do the Ordnance Survey mapping and his relationship to the local community. And he's helped by some members of the community who see this as a sign of progress and development and joining the modern world. And he's hindered by other members of the local community who see this as a theft of their identity. And so that's the way that the story plays out. Eventually, the young British officer disappears. He's suspected to have been killed by these resistors. And the people, this in itself disrupts a huge love affair that had been going on between the British officer and a local girl. So the British officer could only speak English but was enchanted by the Irish language and the Irish place names that it was his job to kind of get rid of, while the local Irish girl speaks only Irish but is in love with the romance of this red-jacketed interloper. And so they fall in love with each other just by repeating these place names. And that's the kind of the message of the incantation of language rather than the kind of instrumental use of language. So this is kind of disrupted in the close of the play, and you're left with with irresolution of linguistic questions on multiple levels about whether it's a necessary, whether it's possible to make that link possible or at least necessary, even if it is impossible. Whether it's at least necessary to make that journey from one linguistic universe to another. Nonetheless, what do you leave behind and what do you gain by moving in that direction? All connected into issues of identity, belonging, affect, emotion, love, and politics. But politics always is the kind of refracted element within that. So the politics is what you're left with as a residue, rather than the other way around, that the politics produces your kind of residue of emotional of issues that should be dealt with artistically in order to manage the emotional contours. You get a kind of notion of emotional contours that resist very much political definition. So to just get out of that one in 3 minutes. Okay, so when the eventual political settlement was reached in Northern Ireland, it could be read, and I have read it in longer pieces of work, as a very bare and to some degree corrupted version of that, in that it has been described by many people as an agreement to disagree about the nature of Northern Ireland. So again, as I sketched earlier, that's to some degree accurate, that you didn't have to ultimately define whether it's British or Irish. You simply had to produce enough symbolic territory such that people could identify as being British or Irish, whether or not they were technically defined as British or Irish. So the one objection would be, but nonetheless, it's still part of Britain. Yes, in a sense, but it has this hanging question mark that if the majority of the population were ever to declare in a plebiscite that they wanted to form part of the rest of Ireland, then that would happen. So it has this kind of hanging deferral mechanism within the institutions. But having, to some degree, received as a gift the imaginative propositions that were put forward by cultural groups such as Field Day, to some degree, the very institutionalization of that gift into a form of institutional language, albeit with that refusal, albeit with lots of gestures of defusal of the time bombs that were calling things. For example, the Royal Ulster Constabulary gets changed into the Police Service of Northern Ireland. So you strip the institutional language of its British connotation, its absolute British connotation, and you open up, again speaking in grand terms, a territory of parity of esteem, as they called it, between the Irish cultural identification and the British cultural identification, supported by investment funds into Irish language and culture and investment funds into local Scottish, the Ulster Scots tradition. So that the notion became the parity of esteem between two traditions. As time has gone on, that very grand and generous and exploratory and intellectually rich cultural intervention hardened first into that notion of parity of esteem, and then parity of esteem itself hardened into institutional language of tolerance of the other tradition, to the extent that now it might be more accurately regarded as a kind of parity of esteem, that there's a kind of a mutual tolerance between communities that is reflected not just in the institutions of government, but also in the cultural space. So there's a kind of impoverishment of a very idealistic and hopeful discourse. But nonetheless, even given all that impoverishment, what should be remembered is that richness contributed grandly, I would say, to even the limited extent in which we can now regard, we can regard a certain impoverishment of a hugely rich tradition, but 2 points should be made: that hugely rich tradition of intellectual exploration still is there should the political conditions change, so it still remains as an archive. And the second is the undoubted, absolutely valuable and positive shift between what was there beforehand and what is there now. And the third point to kind of end on is that whether or not we call that, in some degrees, that is absolutely a transition. It's a transition from something to something else, and it's a transition that remains in process. But the other point is that, at least in Northern Irish terms, and I suspect more broadly, if you talk about the justice within transitional justice terms, then there will always be that tendency for institutional language and process to harden justice down into law. But there will always be the counter effect of thinking through literature and culture, which is what this amounts to, this aesthetics of justice. That is how you can think justice really. Justice can only be felt. It can't be given, taken, provided.
Good. Thank you.